Hello, welcome to the Viewpoint. I am Mudumbuj. Today, in the Viewpoint, the discussion will revolve around a report based on a research that had two questions for itself and sought answers. Question 1. What perceptions do Gambians of different social, political, and economic backgrounds hold about the AU and ECOWAS interventions and the two organizations more generally, and what explains these different perceptions? Well, we know what the government thinks. What the government thinks. It has actually extended the mandate several times. But for the rest of us, what do we think? The research paper, the report, is titled Siding with the People or Occupying Force. It's a question there. Local perceptions of African Union and ECOWAS interventions in the Gambia. It was a collaborative effort between Gambian and German researchers. When you look at the report, it tells you these are really the authors. I've got here Sophia Berchinger, I hope I pronounced that surname well, Sid Matijau, Omar Mba, and Dr. Antonia Witt. And we have the pleasure of having her here in the studio today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. She's a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, yes, Germany. We'll go more into what the institute is about. And on my left here, this is Mr. Karamba Jalo, social researcher at the Center for Research and Policy Development.
Right.
Welcome to the
Glad
Viewpoint.
to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Dr. Witz, so privileged that you could make it, because once we understood that you were here on a short visit, and in fact you're flying back to Germany, is it? Day after this recording. Welcome, your first time?
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. It is my first time in this country.
Yes. First impressions?
My first impression.
Yes.
I have experienced a very warm welcome here,
Yes.
and I sense that this continues the warmth that I'm experiencing. To maybe give a bit of the background of my presence here.
Exactly. Yes.
So we are actually here to present and discuss this report with both sort of those participants that have sort of contributed to this report, those have participated in focus groups or given interviews, but also to, as we do here, to sort of bring it into a broader discussion, to disseminate the findings, to put them up for discussion. I think that was an important aim we had, and I sense that, we sort of hit the nerve in a way with this report thematically. It is something that Gambians debate about these days. For us as researchers, it is a great privilege that we have opportunities like this to talk about our research and to give it sort of meaning also beyond an academic circle. This is something that's extremely important for us. We come, like in my case, I come from a Peace Research Institute whose aim it is to not only, produce academic knowledge for other academics, but also to have an impact in sort of the real world out there. And for this purpose, it is a great privilege for us today to speak to you and to have this opportunity.
That's from the Peace Research Institute. Now from the Center for Policy Research and Policy Development. Mr. Karamba, how do you come into it? How did it come about?
Thank you very much. Like I said, I am a part of the Center for Research and Policy Development, where I coordinate programs that relates to the Justice and Peace and Security Department. And as a result, when the research came up, I decided to be a part of it by way of writing, and expressed my interest to be a part of it. And when I did, I went, and of course I had to meet with them. And in the process, I also met Seth, who is also my boss. Absolutely. So in a nutshell, we all ended up being part of this research. And I guess I was really intrigued by how far we're able to go with it, and of course the results and the successes, I would say, that came therein after we got involved with the Peace Research Institute.
Absolutely. So now let's get into the heart of the matter. Why these two questions? Why this research?
I think I have to explain a bit the sort of the background and the overall picture behind that report. It is part of a broader research project that precisely looks into what we call local perceptions of AU and ECOWAS interventions, and we look at two case studies, Burkina Faso and the Gambia. It ran for the past 3.5 years, that research project, funded by the German Research Foundation. It's the biggest independent research foundation or research funding institution in Germany. And the Gambia is sort of one case study, but there's also the comparative angle in this project. And we've been sort of coming from this observation that the African Union and ECOWAS in particular have been quite active in terms of intervening in member states in situations of political or constitutional crises, not only in sort of situations of violent conflict, that of course as well, but also in these moments of contested transitions, unconstitutional changes of government that might have the potential maybe to develop into something more violent, but that are in themselves rather sort of politically contested moments around questions of election and sort of the organization of the political life of the countries concerned. So we see this, right? There's a growing activity. So when we speak about interventions these days in Africa, we don't speak about external interventions and not so much even UN interventions, but really these activities of African regional institutions being very present in the political lives of their countries. And by this also affecting people's lives. But our observation was that there is little debate about that. There's little concern for how sort of, if I may use that term, in inverted commas, ordinary citizens experience the presence of regional organizations. What do these people expect from institutions like the AU and ECOWAS to do in their countries? Do they think this is generally a good idea of having greater presence of these countries, of these institutions? Or are there outright sort of contestations around the norms or the aims that they are promoting? So this is sort of to understand where we came from, and I think there is this big gap in particular in the academic debate when there is a lot of concern for sort of citizen perspective with regard to UN interventions or even Western states interventions in a certain way. But there is little sort of concern that this is also an interesting and important question when we speak about African interventions. There's sometimes this assumption that AU and ECOWAS are sort of naturally seen as legitimate and sort of helping institutions because of their sort of African identity. I think this is sort of what we wanted to unpack a bit and maybe question that if they intervene in politically contested moments, then I think it's fair to assume that their presence in these moments might also be contested.
That is interesting. So there was that gap, as it were, that you filled in many ways, because as it says in your report, most of the literature had focused on what the establishment said rather than ordinary people. And here, of course, Karamba, there's a social need here, isn't it? Because when we look at the Afrobarometer surveys, yes. I mean, there's been lots of reactions, to say the least, some favorable, others not so favorable. Yeah. It's becoming a social concern, isn't it? Yeah. So it's important to know what was going on. It's serving a social need there, isn't it?
I can't agree more, I guess. I would say I'm quite privileged to have been part of all the Afrobarometer experiences here in the Gambia. I've been part of the round 7, round 8, round 9. So all through I've been the one going out there for the past 4 or 5 years and getting the citizenry and my fellow countrymen engaged about issues. And the reason why I'm very much enticed with what we're able to come up with, that is on the report, and of course the feedbacks that came from the policy environment, is the transition that happened, how things change. Because in 2018, if I still, the facts are still out there, I've noticed that at the time, there was obviously that great divide about whether or not the economic forces should stay here, but then the vast majority were not opinionating that they had to leave. It wasn't quite popular. But today, with time, we've seen how the paradigm shifted. And I think that is why it is really important to me, because of that inductive lens, where the report did not necessarily just recreate an existing hypothesis, but it was able to introduce a new paradigm, a new dimension, of which I would say wasn't explored yet until it came to the limelight. So I guess that is the interesting part, and it is very important to keep a close watch and a look at how things are evolving and how things are changing over time. And I would say the report precisely did that.
Absolutely. And it is structured in sort of 6 chapters, I've realized. It will be interesting to go into them. And the way you've put it, among the first, after your methodology, you've got the intervention context. Maybe that would help, if you could just go into it a bit, help sort of lay the frame, lay the ground for later positions, as it were.
Sure, yeah. I think what might also be important to know is that the report, even though today the discussion is very much focused on ECOMIG, the report takes a broader view, and basically also because the overall project is not only concerned with military interventions, but understands it in a broader sense, also encompassing sort of non-military interventions in the form of mediation or negotiations. And so the context, if you wish, is the 2016 elections and the U-turn, if you want, that Jammeh took, and the impasse, as it is called, as I learned, that resulted from this decision, and then. As a consequence, ECOWAS and the AUs and the UNs, I think we should also speak about sort of the UN's part in this, their reaction to the situation, firstly by means of sort of negotiations and a more sort of one-on-one situation based on representatives of the ECOWAS in this country. But also the special envoys of sitting or former heads of state of the region who came and tried to convince Jammeh to cede and leave the office. But that story sort of evolved, and there was the ECOMIG presence to sort of accompany that process, and then the ECOMIG presence continued even after the impasse was sort of resolved, and President Barrow was sworn into power. So this is sort of the story that we speak about, this evolution of the intervention taking very different forms. At the beginning, we also see that the AU has played a sort of presence, cooperating role at least, and over time we mainly speak about ECOMIG these days, and not so much about an AU intervention. So I think that is also important to understand that we speak about very different phases of AU and ECOWAS presence in this situation.
Absolutely, and it was interesting that, and in the beginning, so I think maybe we'll go through the phases of the intervention, isn't it? Yeah. In the beginning, it appears to have had so much support for whatever reasons. You've identified some narratives, haven't you? Please just start us with that.
Yeah, I guess given my exposure in this field, always I make reference of the then research that preceded, of course, the Peace Research Institute local perception of regional forces experience. And Afrobarometer is always a good example because the idea is to assess the quality of democracy and good governance. And part of the questions that we ask them related to the presence of the economic and also issues of politics, issues of mandate, and I guess this was replicated in our research. But where the difference is the narrative change. And why did the narrative change? I would want to believe there is time, and that is because they overstayed. Many had to put this across, which is also part of the narratives that we explored on the research. And but of course there are always differing opinions, and in as much as some consider them as people who overstayed, there are people also, a good number, who see them as people who should be here, and that their presence is good trouble or necessary trouble. So there is that divide, but all in all, what I can say is the greater majority want them to leave. And this was not what was obtained 3-4 years ago.
That's quite interesting. We will go into that. That's why you've titled your paper "Siding with the People" or occupying force, as it were. And in your research, it seems as if, depending on your social, economic, class, region, all of these factors played into shaping one's views. Just please go into that.
Yeah, I think that is sort of one of the main messages of the report, that there is a difference, if you want, in perceptions and mere opinion. So when we use the term perceptions, we use it as, it is sort of defined as interpreted experience. So people are exposed to experience different things. They could experience the presence of a security officer tagged with the ECOWAS emblem on their shoulder. That could be an experience, but that is interpreted maybe and given meaning in quite different ways. So one person might feel threatened by that security officer, and somebody else will feel protected, to put it in very sort of general ways. It is about the meaning that people attribute to particular experiences, and this is what we study as perceptions. So how people make sense of particular experiences. In this case, how people make sense of the way they experienced the impacts and the reactions, but also the continued presence of ECOMIC. And since we look at perceptions in this way, the question of sort of who experiences what, that is sort of crucial. And people are not exposed to the same experiences.
And who would very much depend, it seems, on geographical location sometimes.
Exactly, precisely geographical location. I mean, in particular now, as we speak about ECOMIC, it of course makes a difference if you are someone from a place that is sort of directly affected by ECOMIC presence. So in particular, we find a sort of very strong narrative in the Foni region, especially, which is maybe different from how people in other parts of the country would speak about the legitimacy or the work of ECOMIC in general. But I think it is like geography is only one aspect. We do see a large divergence between sort of, again, in sort of broad terms, an elite discourse and sort of the broader masses, if you want. What we call everyday citizens, people that are largely disconnected from like the political sphere, from political power, but maybe also from public discourse, etc., economic power as well. So what we find, the siding with the people and the occupying force, that is sort of a debate within maybe the elite, but we find a strong, quite distinct other narrative about this first phase of the intervention, where ordinary sort of citizens, everyday citizens, spell out how the immediate reactions of AU and ECOWAS to the impasse affected their daily lives, and in particular sort of restored normalcy, right? Restored access to market, prevented the maybe horrific scenarios that people had at this moment of how the situation could evolve, prevented the violence that some maybe rightfully sort of feared. This is the narrative that we call everyday peace restored, which is quite prominent within sort of the broader masses. And if I may sort of add a connection to our other case study, it's quite interesting that in Burkina Faso we also found this narrative that you have the elite discourse, you have these two sort of competing sides, right? And then you have a much like maybe depoliticized but very strong narrative of everyday citizens who in these reactions mainly see a good thing because it helped to restore stability, to restore access to markets, to let the everyday life run again. And this sort of elite and everyday citizen discourse and the disconnect, this is something that the report sort of tries to stress. It's not only about geography, but really also about you mentioned like class or social situatedness, political situatedness, that really shapes how people experience these moments, and then of course how they make sense of it.
That's it. But I also wonder though whether politics being part of a party, how much of that sort of contributes to perceptions, and even gender or age. Yeah. I wonder, did you identify any patterns regarding these categories?
Yeah, I was going to even try substantiate that, trying to also establish how politics feature in all of these narratives that we're able to come up with. Now, during the course of our engagement with the citizenry in different parts of the country, from Basse to here in Banjul, in Kanefing, in my neighborhood Bundung, we've discovered that, especially the first narrative titled Siding with the People, people who get to opinionate and also rooting for this narrative are mostly associated with the incumbent, or we will call it the coalition government. So most of the people that had to side with this narrative, their allegiance is to the establishment. And of course, the everyday peace, that is where the balance was struck, and that is where you have people who do not necessarily care about whether the person whose their allegiance to is in power or not, but they were all about the peace, and that is what they're concerned about. And of course, the third narrative, where you have people who opine that the ECOMIC had overstayed their mandate, we were also able to establish that most of these people, their allegiance is to the then governorship. I would say, to be precise, the APRC establishment. So to a considerable extent, of course, you cannot disassociate or bring about a disjunction between politics and these narratives. Essentially, they were able to inform and influence some of these feedbacks that came from those that we engage with through focus group discussions and through tete-a-tete interviews.
Yes. Well, what about gender lines? Have we identified any pattern along gender lines, and sort of with even age? Yeah. Possibly the older generation would tend to maybe side with whatever government says, I don't know, and the younger generation will fall into other categories.
Of course, that is why we were able to ensure that we had this all-women focus group, which I moderated, And I've observed, like Antonio alluded to, the experiences differ, and how it affected women is different from how it affected youngsters like us at the time. Because in 2016, I could recall, then I was at uni, so essentially I would say it impeded how I get to attend classes, and how I get to maybe get to the field and of course play soccer. But it was really different with the women, and most of the feedbacks that we were able to get from them related to the economic dimension, and of course talking about family. So this was essentially their concern. So that differing sense was really key, and we could see this changing across all groups. We had, of course, the elderly, and even people that we called exploiticians, a group of exploiticians who also had a different view and a different experience vis-a-vis the impasse. So, but essentially I would say all groups were equally considered, and we engaged with them, and their feedback differed from one another.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would like us to consider what I call sort of the factors of influence, if you like. I mean, you go to the Fonyi areas, I mean, it's obvious why a good number of them would resent the presence of, for instance, Senegalese soldiers there, given the specific circumstances there. Now, for instance, let me go to what we call the elites. So what would be the factors? So here I imagine that the elites would want the continued, if you like, a presence of economic here. So what are these factors of influence on all these different groups? You know what I mean? You have the physical stuff, they are there, and the elite interest. Let's go through these factors of influence.
I think you summarized that already very well. Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to this fast phase, the impasse, I think there we really clearly see the political aspect coming in, right? You have really sort of the two camps, if you want, divided. One saying ECOWAS came and AU came to side with the people, whereas the APRC or sort of former Jammeh supporters back then employ this narrative of ECOWAS actually is or came as an occupying force. They came with they came with an intention that was different from what they presented us to be the case. So. Their initial intention was different already. They could have, I mean, and this is the sort of the main accusation. They could have used different means. It would not have been necessary to come by military force. And this is sort of the political debate that you have about this. And I think the same sort of applies to the continued presence of ECOMEC. That you also see this division within the elite. Even though I think you don't have these, the two camps aren't that clearly separated, because you have a much broader debate on the presence of ECOMEC, or the rejection of the continued presence that comes from different sides. It's not only the political factor, and so the question of political affiliation isn't so dominant, apart from the fact that yes, the government continues to legitimate the presence of ECOMEC. So that would be a factor that clearly explains a sort of allegiance to the government if you vocally legitimate the presence of the forces.
That's it. And of course, question of AU and ECOWAS, our perceptions of these bodies, this in itself can also influence our perception of the interventions. So what was it? What were some of the findings of generally, what do you think about the AU and ECOWAS? Are the two sort of, have we merged them into one in our heads? What do you think?
Yeah, I would say people were able to make some sort of a differentiation between AU and ECOWAS, and they did understand that.
In fact,
yeah.
let's just hold that thought.
Okay.
We'll go for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
As the fastest growing GSM company in the Gambia, QCell has the widest 4G plus coverage in the country, 3 times faster internet speed than our competitors. So switch now and dial *335# and enjoy what true 4G feels like. QCell, the Gambia's trusted network.
Hello, welcome back to the Viewpoint. I've got in the studio here 2 researchers, Dr. Antonio Witz from the Research Institute in Germany, and I've got here from our Center for Research and Policy Development, Mr. Karamba Jalo. We're really discussing here the different perceptions, the varying categories of perceptions of what causes ordinary people on the continued presence of economic forces in here. Just before the break, I was asking you about the perceptions, people's perceptions of the AU and ECOWAS. What emerged?
Yeah, so I think I'm still stuck with one thing, and that is I wouldn't say people are quite close to these organizations. Of course, they know about their existence, and of course, they know that there is a differentiation in terms of mandate, in terms of what they're tasked to do. But because often when you talk about EU and ECOWAS, they describe as organizations of the people. It is even more or less their mantra. But it seems that their presence is not really felt at the grassroots. And for the most people that I've spoke to, that I've interviewed, and people that I've said focus group with would say the same thing. And it was no different. It was quite surprising that even within urban Gambia, these narrations or narratives kept reoccurring. And I guess that says something about this organization. It kind of explains how somewhat far they are from the people, and there is obviously that lacuna, that gap that needs to be bridged. I don't know if it is communications that needs to be intensified, or they need to look from the humanist perspective how to kind of get closer to the people. But all in all, I would say people do not feel their presence that much in this country. And I still recall a respondent telling me that I got to know about these organizations when we experienced the impasse in 2016. So prior to that, for someone who is close to 30, did not know much about these organizations. I would say even all about these organizations. The only thing that he knew was that they existed, and often you would see them in countries where there are unrest or conflict. So that tells a lot.
Maybe that also tells us a bit about our educational system, I suppose. Yes, and then it was fascinating reading the report that they seem even more remote from AU than ECOWAS. And you said earlier on it was really AU that was doing all the negotiations with former President Jammeh, but afterwards it was really ECOWAS. It was more ECOWAS focused in dealing with the different aspects. What does that tell us? I mean, what do we glean from that? What's the significance of that information, I wonder?
Yeah, I think at the first glance that was, as a result, that's sort of not surprising, because I think ECOWAS is also much more present through other policies, right? I mean, we speak, and I mean, there's a lot of debate about, but we speak about mobility within the region, the ECOWAS ID. That was also quite often sort of mentioned in the focus groups and the discussions when debate was about how much AU and ECOWAS sort of benefit individual people's sort of lives or circumstances. So I think ECOWAS presence, or that there is this sort of greater proximity felt. I think that is also explained by these other policies that are more visible, even though they are still not as visible maybe as they were intended to be, and might not have the positive effect that they might were supposed to have. But I think, and in general, I mean, from an AU perspective, sort of this is also maybe the division of labor, the idea that you have this overall continental organization and then sub-regional organizations that are supposed to be sort of chained, if you want, to the continental level. So it should play out as a system that works and should be synchronized. And I think we see quite often, especially in conflict situations, that this synchronization doesn't really play out in practice. So we have competition between the AU and ECOWAS, and this is also what people sense. But I think in this research we found quite often that in the debates, AU and ECOWAS are merged together. So it's often debate about they, and then but then when people reference something, it's rather it's rather ECOWAS. So I think from an AU perspective, that of course raises crucial questions and maybe should raise concern that the AU is only associated with these sort of heavy crisis moments, something that sort of pops from the sky, right? And then comes if things are really bad, then the AU suddenly comes. That is an issue that we also see in I think in debates in other countries in the region, where you have this sort of sudden presence of the AU, and then people say, well, you know, now you pop up. Where have you been before?
Absolutely, and even questions of legitimacy would arise. Was that much talk about the legitimacy for coming in?
Of course, and they came up with this analogy of other countries where conflicts are happening, such as Mali was made reference, even Sudan, and so many other countries that experience conflict or political unrest, and even Guinea as well. And what they couldn't fathom is why would they choose the Gambia? Why would they decide to intervene militarily and not do the same in other countries? So in their view, there is that sectionalism, there is that discrimination within EU and ECOWAS and how they get to conduct their affairs with their member states. And for most of these people, they believe that it is because we do not have that much prowess, and our external polarities are not that eminent and huge from within and from without. And as a result, we were kind of forced into these things. It was more or less a superimposition. Yeah.
That's interesting. So there really what you refer to, the inconsistency of these bodies in applying stuff that undermines their legitimacy.
Verily.
Quite fascinating there. And here, another running sore, of course, has been Senegal. Isn't it? Because of geography. Oh God, how do you deal with that? And entirely surrounded by this. This is the one, it seems, that generates a lot of emotion, doesn't it? A lot of reaction. How can one deal with this one? Tell us a bit about that.
It does. It definitely generates a lot of emotions, and I think that question cannot be, you know, separated from the overall question of economics. So this is really at the heart of the debate, and I think it sort of comes with the fact that people sense that the Senegalese presence sort of is because of Senegalese interests, and so that there is another sort of purpose for which Senegalese troops are in the country, and if we look at ECOMIC overall, I think what nourishes this is, on the one hand, of course, that the Senegalese contribution to the force is the large majority. It is sort of it outnumbers both the Nigerian and the Ghanaian contingents. but then secondly, it is also nourished by the fact that the ECOMIG mandate has, for most of the time, been vague and not clearly formulated, neither formulated maybe nor communicated to the broader public. That was the case at the very beginning. It was, I think, the force commander, after weeks in public, in press conferences, who sort of at that point then explained what ECOMIG's mandate actually is.
That's General Njai, I think. That's
exactly, General Njai, the force commander back then. But it wasn't sort of explained by ECOWAS, right? And that made a difference. And I think that continued. If you look at the extensions, the decisions to extend the mandate, they usually make up one line, 2 lines maybe. The last one made, I think, 3 lines, but still, it doesn't quite explain what the purpose of this mission is in the country. Also the different deployments, because obviously there is a difference. And what sort of, to what general strategy that feeds, or what general strategy that feeds into, right? I mean, what will be the point where the presence will be stopped, where the mission will be dismantled. So and all that vagueness surely creates a sort of great base for rumors, for speculations, for I mean, I think we as human beings sort of try to make sense. So if people aren't provided with information, they make sense themselves, right? This isn't something specific to this context. This is something we observe in various fields of human life. So it also applies here. People have their theories about, and they observe things as well. So yeah, I think this definitely nourishes and sort of further makes the strong Senegalese presence in the force, makes it even like more problematic, if you want.
Absolutely. This thing between Gambia and Senegal, some of us remember back in the 70s, Salada Keiraba Jawara complaining to the UN Secretary General about the ulterior motives of Senegal. Can you imagine? That's back in the 70s. But this is it. Let's talk a bit more on the risks, really, we run with this lack of communication. At first, everybody appreciated, welcomed them, but gradually support's been ebbing away, as it were. What risks do we face, really, when we ignore this evidence from the ground?
I guess I would conclude that most people are aggrieved right about now, and they've shared this with me and every other person on the team who had these engagements with them. And I think the results of people that are aggrieved and these things battling up within the civil space would mean uproar, and within the military space would mean the possibilities of a coup. And this was also explored in one of our narratives where we spoke about the enduring stay of the economic forces. And here we also saw a great divide where a section of the respondents said that of course we want them here to guide the transition as we transition into a democracy or move towards democratization. But there are other people who said that they need to, if they leave, there is the possibility of a coup. And that is also a narrative that was explored on the report. But I think all in all, I would say the results are not going to be positive if they decide to stay a lot longer, because especially we need the Foni district of the West Coast region. I would say the responses are uniform, and that is they want to see them packing. And they've not only affected them in terms of the timber business, but they've also affected so many other aspects, even their social life. They've spoke about women getting pregnant, and some of this I wouldn't say has really been confirmed, but there are issues of these things coming from that part of the country. And of course the proxy wars that Senegal have a vested interest in the Gambia to kind of cope the rebellion in the south of Senegal, which is Casamas. And of course we've seen instances where a fracas existed between the rebel faction and of course the Senegalese forces. So in a wise they're not very comfortable getting caught up in this crossfire, and I think that is one of the reasons why they've been very outspoken and also very critical about their presence there.
That's it. But it seems now, where we stand now, there's this narrative of fear of a coup to justify the presence, and the other narrative that is gaining weight, it's gaining up overstayers, as it were, as we speak right now, isn't it? Essentially, yeah.
I think this is what the report is trying to show, that when we speak about today, there is this great polarization, and the overstaying narrative is really widespread, and yeah, takes this turn to an even sort of more pronounced sort of critique in the Foni region, where people use this term of compare ECOMIC to an oppressor. So we have these. We initially had this term of an occupying force, but we have this narrative today of oppressors because of the sort of observations in people's daily lives, and I think this sort of, we allude to this potential of the sort of grey polarization, and that this is something that should concern, of course, ECOWAS, but maybe also policymakers more broadly, and maybe to sort of come back to our initial aspect about studying perceptions, and what I said about the sort of the difference between perceptions and opinion. I think with the concept of perceptions, what is usually alluded to is that this isn't just sort of individual thinking, right? But that perceptions can really drive behavior, individual behavior, but then also collective behavior. And as we sort of study broader narratives, and not only what sort of individual human beings think, but we try to really unpack shared narratives across different groups of the society. So I think this is a way of understanding the potential social dynamics that this could have. And I think we've seen sort of in the region in particular the great sort of effect that sentiments, shared narratives and perceptions can have. When we see the political developments in Guinea, in Mali, in Burkina, I think you really see the growing importance of, if you want, the masses as sort of political drivers, even though maybe the situation sort of turned different then. But yeah, we see this growing importance, and I think this is something that this report sort of alludes to, that narratives can drive sort of collective behavior as well, and this is something that should be taken sort of seriously, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just thinking.
Yes, absolutely. And these perceptions, they don't necessarily have to cohere, factually cohere at all, because of the lived element perhaps plays a part, and when we live in different areas. But now we're heading really towards the end, where we talk about the balance of perceptions. Siding with the people or an occupying force?
Quite interesting.
I mean, going in the future now, what would you say? And for instance, this information report, maybe it's unfair to ask, but I'll push it anyway. How policymakers now, what to make of this report in how we deal with the situation, isn't it? And please, we're going to the balance of perceptions and what policymakers, us, even ordinary citizens. What are we doing?
I guess I'm talking about balance. I would say it is quite clear now Gambians want the economic to live. And why do I say this is because it was really interesting that Gambians had to recognize the good side of the economic. I mean, what they would even call social corporate responsibilities. This is coming from one of the contingents who have engaged with. And they said some of these things that they did for the communities where they're stationed is intentional. And of course, they're very much concerned and also interested in making sure that there is that smooth relationship that exists between them as a force and also those that host them, which are the communities where they're stationed. So the people did recognize that, of course, they've been doing good. They've been helping them in various aspects at the mosque. They've refurbished mosque, they've built schools, and also they've been helping out during community festivities and all. Notwithstanding, they concluded that they need to leave anyways. And why? Is because they would prioritize the interests and also the well-being of our own national security forces than a foreign force. So this is quite popular across all regions or all places that we've visited. And about whether or not the governorship gets to recognize and of course make good use of these reports, I don't think that is entirely dependent on us as social researchers or anthropologists. Of course, we've done our part and we've ensured that we held interfaces and discussions and did nationwide disseminations. Just as we promised them when we visited in 2021, 2022, that we were going to come back with a report that will be representative of your views, and once we make sense of the data, in any case, we'll come back to you and you will tell us whether or not what you said is replicated on the reports. They did appreciate that, and we did this. And when we sat again, it was more or less the same thing that they had to put to us. So we've made sure that we fulfilled our part of the bargain. So it is dependent on the policy tacticians, the strategists, the governorship to kind of recognize these recommendations because they're coming from concerned citizens, and these are real opinions and also perceptions, I would say, that are really critical, and I guess they should be considered.
That's it. And perhaps it was because of that recognition, as you said, it says in your report, in December when we extended 2022, when we extended further, they said, okay, now we will reduce the size of the mission and promise to introduce other things as well that would look at local outlook. Maybe they'll get the Senegalese away from Fonyi, that many people have been saying. So maybe these are some of the ways that sort of they show that they're responding to what people feel. Maybe that's the key forward.
Yeah, I think the last mandate extension can be interpreted in that way as a response to that. I mean, there was mention of the potential sort of downsizing. There was mention of the reconsideration of the composition, whatever is behind that formulation. But I think it shows that there is sort of it's a reaction to something. But I think the general sort of practical takeaway really is that communication matters, and however the mission will go on, it will need to be communicated much better to different audiences, to different groups, and that requires sort of explanation of the mandate, but also a continuous sort of communication in that sense is not only explaining, right, sending, but also receiving. So I think one of the key, if you want, practical takeaways is that missions like this should have really inbuilt mechanisms to engage the broader population and to not only communicate the mission's role and presence, but also to sort of continuously sense what is going on the ground in terms of narratives and perceptions, and to sort of feed that back. I think that this is a very strong takeaway that one can take from this experience.
That's it, and perhaps it's that lack of communication that we still have, how you frame it, key points of contestation.
Yeah.
Real, isn't
course,
it?
yeah.
Which is important now going forward. Yeah. The role with Senegal, that's really for politicians, and the agreement as well, 2017. What was the agreement? The communication. So as we go forward, these are the key points that we're going to contest in the future, isn't it?
Of course, there is a lot of things that the public is oblivious of. They don't necessarily know why they're still here. They also do not know what the mandate is. And this has been a question that they've been asking. And I think that is the more reason why they frown about their presence here. Because for most of them, I think they would have compromised a little if they knew how long, for instance, they were going to stay, and also if they were a bit closer to the people. But for the most part, I've seen people opine that the economic forces are more or less a state security instrument. They're here to protect the executive government, and that is why you only get to see them when the convoy is moving, and and possibly where they station, where these contingents are stationed, that is where you get to see a little bit of rapport and also an understanding. But for the other parts which falls under their jurisdiction, where they should go and survey and do the patrols, these other communities only get to see them move up and then go down back to their barracks. So there is that disconnect between what is perceived to be their mandate and what they're doing here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've really we've come to the end. And this is the report, PRIF report, that's Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. It is online. I downloaded it the other day. It is important that we all read this. I mean, these days we talk about evidence-based decision-making. Yes, this is what researchers are here for, to give us the evidence. Thank you very much for coming. Dr. Antonia Witt from the Institute, senior researcher, and Mr. Karamba Diallo from the Center for Research and Policy Development in Gambia. Thank you very much, viewers. Until next time, I'm Mudum Bunch. Goodbye. Cheers.